I was wrapping gauze around a little girl's fevered arm at a remote mountain clinic in Guatemala when my phone started buzzing in the pocket of my scrubs. I figured it was a logistics update or a message from another volunteer, but the moment I saw the name on the screen, Franklin, Stepfather, a cold knot twisted in my stomach, tighter than any I'd felt in years. Franklin, my late mother's second husband, had been a thorn in my side for nearly 3 decades, and if there was one truth I'd learned the hard way, it was that nothing good ever came from his calls. Still, against better judgment and with a flicker of dread, I answered. "Lena," he said, his voice overly cheery, syrupy in a way that always made me brace for the worst. "Thought you should know. I sold the mountain cabin." My breath caught. I stood motionless in the harsh midday sun, gauze in hand, my heart plummeting. "You did what?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my voice betrayed me. "Sold it," he repeated, like he was talking about getting rid of some old lawn furniture. "Didn't see the point in holding on to something you barely use. And, between you and me, I needed the cash. You'll thank me one day." He chuckled. A low, smug sound that burned through me like acid. Around me, the buzz of the village faded into a numb silence. The sound of children laughing behind the clinic, the hum of insects in the fields, all of it dulled under the thunderstorm building in my chest. The cabin wasn't just some rustic getaway, it was sacred ground. It was where my mother and I used to spend summers picking blackberries and reading by oil lamps, where I'd retreated after each heartbreak, each loss. It was the one place I still felt close to her after she passed. And now Franklin had traded it off like a pawn ticket in a losing bet. His bet, his debts, his disaster. But what he didn't know, and what I wasn't about to remind him of, was that the cabin wasn't his to sell. It wasn't even mine alone. Years ago, I'd purchased it with my closest friend, Jill, and we'd signed a co-ownership agreement that required both of our signatures for any sale to be legal. I hung up before his smugness could poison me further. The phone trembled in my hand as I walked slowly back toward the supply tent, my thoughts racing. He thought I was still that quiet girl he could steamroll, but he was about to learn something new. This time, I wasn't backing down. I sat alone on the edge of my cot, the sounds of the clinic fading into the background, replaced by the relentless echo of Franklin's voice rattling through my mind. He thought he'd won, thought that by catching me thousands of miles from home and far from any legal leverage, I'd be powerless to stop him. But what he didn't realize, what he never bothered to understand, was that I had grown beyond the frightened girl who once let him control the narrative. I opened my contacts and tapped Jill's name. My fingers trembled, not from fear but from the rush of adrenaline that comes when betrayal meets clarity. "Hey, Lena!" Her voice was cheerful, as if she didn't yet sense the storm coming. "He sold the cabin," I blurted out, trying and failing to disguise the fury simmering beneath my words. There was a long silence on her end, the kind that stretches just enough to mirror the disbelief you can't put into words. "He what?" "He sold it," I repeated, each word bitter in my throat. Apparently, he had gambling debts to settle and figured the cabin was his golden ticket out. Jill didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice dropped, sharp and certain. "That man has no shame." "None," I said. "But he also has no legal standing." Even as I said it, a wave of relief surged through me, mingled with old anger that had long gone unspoken. Our co-ownership agreement is still active. He can't sell that property without both of our signatures. "Exactly," Jill replied, already shifting into problem-solving mode. "I'll dig up the documents and start reviewing everything. When are you coming back?" "As soon as I can wrap things up here, I want to be ready for whatever he tries next." "Good," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to shut this down. Together." I ended the call, but even after the screen went dark, I sat still for a long time, staring at my reflection in the glossy black glass. My face was tired, lined by sun and time, but beneath the exhaustion was a glimmer of something harder. Resolve. The truth was, that cabin was never just real estate. It was the last piece of my mother I still had. Before Franklin came along with his charm and his false promises, it was just the two of us, me and Mom, spending summers in those pine-blanketed hills outside of Harper's Ridge, roasting marshmallows over the fire and chasing fireflies until the stars blurred our vision. After she married him, everything changed. The laughter in the cabin grew quieter. The shadows inside it grew longer. When she died, it became my sanctuary again. I poured everything I had into restoring it, not just the walls and windows, but the spirit of it. Jill and I had painted the porch ourselves on a rainy fall weekend, hammered every nail in the new roof with our own hands, and shared more sleepless nights beside that fireplace than I could count. It was more than wood and stone. It was memory, blood, and breath. And Franklin, who had never lifted a single finger to preserve that space, had the audacity to sell it like it was nothing but a poker chip he didn't mind losing. The injustice of it cracked something open in me, not just because of the sale, but because of what it represented. Franklin had always taken. When my mother was alive, he took her time, her warmth, her confidence. After she passed, he turned his attention to me, cloaking control in the language of concern, masking manipulation as familial duty. And for too long, I let him. Not anymore. I opened my journal, the same one I'd carried through volunteer missions across borders and languages, and began to write, pouring memory into the pages like water finding its level. I wrote about the first time I saw the cabin as a child, how it smelled of cedar and wood smoke, how the stairs creaked when you snuck out for midnight cocoa. I wrote about Franklin's arrival in our lives, the way his smile never reached his eyes, the way he gradually replaced presence with pressure. And I wrote about the moment, just hours ago, when I realized he'd finally overplayed his hand. That cabin was my history, my heritage, and my healing. He could try to take it, but this time, I wasn't going to let him. The next morning, Jill called again. Her tone had changed, still steady, but now carrying the sharpened edge of someone holding the truth in her hands. "I reviewed the agreement," she said. "He didn't have the authority. Legally, the sale isn't valid. It can't go through without my signature. And I didn't give it." For a moment, I let the relief sink in, like breath returning after being held underwater too long. "Do we know who the buyer is?" I asked. "Not yet," she said. "But I've started pulling county property records. There's no official transfer filed yet, which makes me think he tried to do it off the books." That sounds exactly like him. Franklin had always relied on cutting corners and playing dumb when he got caught, but this time his shortcuts had run into a wall made of contracts, witnesses, and two women who were no longer willing to be quiet. "What's our next move?" I asked. "Well, we can confront him directly or we can go the legal route. Either way, we're in the right. He doesn't have a leg to stand on." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Let's be smart, let's be thorough, and let's be ready. As I hung up, a calm clarity settled over me, not because the fight was over, but because for the first time I felt like I was fighting from solid ground. He thought I was just a memory in the rearview mirror, too far away and too soft to matter. But what he didn't know was that every mile I'd travelled, every hardship I'd overcome, every moment I'd spent helping others survive, had forged me into someone he never expected. Someone who fights back. The next few days passed in a blur, though nothing about them was idle or aimless. I buried myself in my volunteer work during daylight hours, tending to patients and rationing supplies with mechanical focus. But beneath that surface routine, something far more deliberate was taking root. At night, while the others slept or swapped stories over lukewarm coffee, I sat under the dim lantern light with my notebook, sketching out a plan as precise and steady as a surgeon's cut. I wasn't just angry. I was preparing. Franklin believed that distance meant powerlessness, that being overseas would somehow keep me from pushing back, He was counting on silence, banking on the same compliance I'd shown him in the years after Mom died, when I had no voice and even fewer choices. But what he hadn't factored in was time that had sharpened my instincts, hardened my resolve, and taught me how to navigate quietly until the moment came to strike. Each night, I reviewed every piece of correspondence I'd ever had with Franklin that mentioned the cabin, searching for anything that might reveal a paper trail or a pattern. I forwarded emails to myself, screen-captured text messages, and began building a digital archive to support what Jill and I already knew. The sale wasn't just invalid, it reeked of fraud. Jill, ever efficient and unwavering, had already reached out to our real estate attorney, a woman named Deborah Glassman, who had helped us structure the co-ownership agreement when we first bought the place. Deborah didn't mince words when she reviewed the situation. "This isn't just a breach of agreement," she told Jill. "If he misrepresented ownership to a buyer, that crosses into criminal territory. I'll start drafting a cease and desist letter immediately." Hearing those words filled me with a complicated mixture of validation and dread. I didn't want this fight. Not really. What I wanted was peace and space, and to be left alone in the one place that still felt like mine. But if Franklin insisted on dragging me into his mess, then I'd make sure he regretted it. When I finished my assignment 2 weeks later and finally flew back to the States, my return wasn't dramatic. There was no cinematic music playing as I stepped off the plane, just the quiet hum of the airport and the weight of what awaited me. I drove straight to my apartment, dropped off my luggage, and barely glanced at the unopened mail that had stacked up like fallen leaves at my door. My eyes were fixed forward toward the next move, and then, right on cue, my phone rang. I saw Franklin's name flash across the screen, and this time, instead of flinching, I let the call connect. "Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter," he drawled, his tone oozing the same faux charm that had duped so many over the years. "Back to real life, huh?" "What do you want, Franklin?" I asked, skipping the pretense. "Oh, just wanted to make sure you're not too heartbroken over the whole cabin situation. I mean, it's done now. No sense crying over spilled milk." I paused, not because I was searching for words, but because I wanted him to sit in the silence, feel it coil around him like a warning. Then I spoke, calm but clear. "Funny you should say that," I replied, "because from where I stand, the sale isn't done at all. Jill and I pulled the records. There's no change in title, and without her signature, the transaction is null. You can't sell what doesn't belong solely to you." He hesitated, and though it lasted no more than a heartbeat, I heard the tremor slip into his voice like a crack forming in ice. "That's ridiculous. The buyer paid cash. The paperwork's handled. It's a done deal." "No, Franklin," I said quietly. "It's fraud. And we have the documentation to prove it." There was no yelling, no slammed phone or dramatic threats. Just a click as he ended the call, and the hollow sound of an old tactic failing to work on someone who no longer feared him. The next morning, Jill and I met in person for the first time in months. We sat at her kitchen table surrounded by manila folders and legal pads, while Deborah joined via video conference. The cease and desist letter was finalized and ready to go. The language was surgical, clear, firm, and legally airtight. "If he makes any further moves, we'll escalate immediately," Deborah said, her tone leaving no room for interpretation. Jill and I nodded in unison. "Let him try," I said. That afternoon I visited the cabin, not for sentiment but for strategy. I documented every inch of the property, the worn porch swing, the fireplace we'd rebuilt, even the creaky pantry door Franklin used to complain about. If this went to court, I wanted every detail logged, every memory safeguarded. Back in town, I followed up with the local real estate office and tracked down the agent involved in the supposed sale. A woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a cautious voice. She met me in a small office lined with house listings and sympathy cards. "Look," she began, her hands folded on the desk. "Franklin told me he had full authority." He showed me documents. Old ones, apparently. If I'd known the cabin had a co-owner, I never would have touched the deal. Well, now you know, I said gently, and we're not looking to make enemies. But we do need your help. Can you confirm he signed a loan? She nodded slowly. Yes, and I actually flagged the transaction in the system. It hasn't been processed. If you need the paperwork, I'll provide it. I left her office with a flash drive full of damning documents and a sense of control I hadn't felt in weeks. Franklin had played a risky game, assuming I wouldn't see the board until it was too late. But he hadn't realised. I'd been watching all along. That evening, Jill called again. The letter's been sent, she said. Let's see how long it takes for the panic to set in. I smiled, not with cruelty, but with the quiet, steady satisfaction of someone reclaiming what should never have been taken. The next move was his, but the difference this time? I was ready, armed with facts, with law, and with a fire that years of silence had only made stronger. When I finally arrived at the cabin a few days later, I expected the air to feel cleansing, like it always had. A balm for everything that never made sense. But instead of peace, I was met with a silence that felt too heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of everything Franklin had tried to undo. The plants I'd left by the windowsill drooped under dust and neglect. Unopened mail had piled near the threshold, and even the air inside carried the stale scent of absence, as though the space had held its breath in my absence, waiting for the truth to walk back through the door. I dropped my bags and stood still for a moment, allowing the full weight of it to settle on my shoulders. Not just the betrayal, but the responsibility of reclaiming what had been so carelessly risked. And before I had a chance to begin unpacking or even clear my mind, the phone vibrated again. And of course it was him. Franklin. This time I didn't hesitate. I answered with the steadiness of someone who knew exactly where she stood. Well, well, he began, the smugness in his voice as thick as ever. If it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter. Finally back from saving the world. Welcome home. What do you want, Franklin? I said plainly, not bothering with niceties. I just figured I'd check in, he said, pretending concern. You know, see if you've come to terms with the cabin. It's gone now, Lena. What's done is done. It took everything in me not to laugh, not out of amusement, but at the sheer audacity of his delusion. Actually, I said, my tone even, it's not gone. Jill and I reviewed the property records. There's been no legal transfer, no finalised transaction, and since the cabin was never yours to sell outright, the sale is invalid. There was a pause just long enough for me to feel the shift, like a poker player whose bluff had just been called. That's absurd, he replied, his voice suddenly strained. The buyer paid cash. It's done. I handled the paperwork myself. No, you forged your way through it, I corrected, my voice still calm but colder now. And unless Jill suddenly changed her signature and forgot to mention it to me, you broke the law. The line went quiet again, but I could hear the shallow hitch in his breath, that familiar sound he made when his stories started to collapse beneath him. You think you're so smart, he muttered, his tone slipping from charm to contempt. You always have, always acting like you're better than the rest of us. You don't know what I've been dealing with. I had debts, Lena. Real ones. I did what I had to do. You stole from me, I said, and this time the edge in my voice came through clearly, steady and hard. And you thought I'd be too far away or too weak to do anything about it. But you were wrong. I'm not the teenager you used to push around. I know my rights now, and I know exactly what you did. His voice cracked with forced indignation. You're really going to destroy your own stepfather over this? After everything I did for your mother? My hands tightened around the phone as the words landed, not because they hurt, but because they were so deeply familiar, like the refrain of a song I'd grown sick of hearing. He had used my mother's memory like a shield for years, twisting it into a currency to justify every lie, every betrayal. You didn't do anything for her, I said, keeping my voice level. You manipulated her just like you tried to manipulate me. And now you're going to deal with the consequences. And just like that, he hung up. Not with a slam, but with a silence that said more than any words ever could. I stood there with the phone still pressed to my ear, the quiet buzzing of disconnection somehow more satisfying than any shouted apology he could have offered. Later that afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, a fresh cup of coffee growing cold beside me, while Jill forwarded the legal documents we'd compiled. The agreement was airtight. No transaction could be made without mutual consent, and Franklin's signature alone carried no legal weight. Deborah, our attorney, had already drafted a second letter, more forceful than the first, with clear notice that any further interference would result in immediate legal action. And as I reviewed the packet of documentation, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not the fragile calm of retreat, but the grounded clarity of someone who's finished running. Then, just before dusk, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, there he was, Franklin, in the flesh, looking as if he had aged 10 years in a week. He wore that familiar half-smile, the one meant to disarm, but this time it faltered at the edges. He didn't wait to be invited in. He stepped across the threshold like it still belonged to him. I watched him lower himself into one of the chairs at the kitchen table without asking, and I remained standing, arms folded, silent. "Look," he said finally, forcing a sigh as though he'd come in peace. "I know you're upset, but you have to understand the position I was in, the people I owe. They don't wait kindly. I just needed a way out." "And you thought taking what wasn't yours was the answer?" I asked, keeping my tone low but unwavering. "That cabin meant something to me. It's the last piece of my mother I have left." "It's just a place, Lena," he said, his voice laced with weariness, but not remorse. "You barely come here anymore. What's the point of holding on to something you've already left behind?" I stepped closer then, not to intimidate, but to ensure he saw my face when I said it. Because it's mine. Because every floorboard, every dented cabinet, every creaking stair holds memories you were never a part of. You don't get to decide what matters to me, or what I protect. His eyes darkened, and for a flicker of a second, I saw something raw and rattled in him. "You wouldn't really go to the police, would you?" he asked, trying to regain footing. "You wouldn't do that to your own family." I met his gaze without flinching. "Try me." He stood, more quickly than he intended, knocking the chair slightly as he did. Without another word, he turned and left, the screen door clattering shut behind him like a gavel coming down. I didn't chase him. Instead, I returned to the table, took a sip of now lukewarm coffee, and exhaled a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. For the first time in years, Franklin had been the one to retreat, and I had been the one to draw the line. This wasn't just about property. It was about boundaries, and mine had finally been carved in stone. In the days that followed Franklin's uninvited visit, the tension didn't vanish, but it shifted. Where there had once been chaos and helplessness, now there was order, process, and undeniable proof. I no longer felt like someone fighting in the dark. Instead, I had facts, allies, and the law at my back. Jill and I had gathered every piece of documentation we could find. The co-ownership agreement, every email and text Franklin had sent that hinted at the sale, and even a notarized statement from the real estate agent confirming that he had acted alone, without proper authority. Deborah, our attorney, moved quickly, her confidence both grounding and invigorating. She filed a formal cease and desist that left no room for ambiguity, and within 24 hours, we received confirmation that it had been delivered. Franklin, for all his arrogance, must have felt the walls beginning to close in, but knowing him, I suspected he still believed he could bluff his way through it. Then, on a damp Thursday morning, my phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, and direct. Miss Harper, this is Detective Mark Ellison with the Morrow County Sheriff's Department. I've reviewed the documents your attorney and co-owner provided. It's clear that the sale was unauthorized, and based on what we've gathered, we're prepared to move forward with a formal investigation, provided that's something you're willing to pursue. I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said, steady and certain. I want to move forward. Understood, he replied. We'll begin by speaking with the buyer and the agent. If Mr. Dawson continues to interfere, or if we find any evidence of forged documentation, we'll escalate to criminal charges. As I ended the call, I stood at the window of the cabin and watched the mist curling through the trees. It wasn't triumph I felt, at least not in the way I imagined revenge might feel when I was younger, but something quieter and deeper. It was clarity. It was vindication. It was knowing that, after so many years of being brushed aside or talked down to, I was finally being heard. Later that day, Jill came over and we spent the afternoon reviewing our files one last time, making sure everything was in order. She was calm, but I could tell the weight of it all had settled on her too. We weren't just fighting for a deed or a property line. We were defending something sacred. Something built with care and love and long weekends sanding porch rails in silence. That evening, Franklin called again. His voice for the first time didn't carry confidence. It was laced with something raw, panic dressed in indignation. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he spat, barely waiting for a hello. "You're ruining everything." "No," I said, my tone flat, unshaken. "I'm protecting what's mine. You did this to yourself." "You've always been ungrateful," he growled. "I stepped up when your mother was too fragile to handle things, and this is how you repay me." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. You didn't step up, Franklin. You stepped in. You inserted yourself where no one asked you to be, took advantage of people who trusted you, and now you're facing the consequences. He launched into another tirade, but I'd heard it all before. The guilt-tripping, the blame-shifting, the desperate plea for control masked as righteousness. So I cut him off. "This conversation is over," I said. "If you have anything else to say, you can take it up with my lawyer." And with that, I hung up. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. 2 days later, Detective Ellison called again with the news I'd been waiting for. "We spoke with the buyer," he said. "They were unaware of the co-ownership agreement and have agreed to halt the transaction. As far as the county is concerned, the property remains under your and Ms. Alden's ownership." Relief, true and full-bodied, surged through me, but it didn't end there. "Also," the detective continued, "we've reviewed the signed sale documents. Based on the evidence of misrepresentation, we're moving forward with charges of fraudulent conveyance and attempted theft of property. Mr. Dawson will be required to appear in court. From what I've seen, the case is strong." I sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the finality of those words. My voice, when it returned, was low but sure. "Thank you," I said, "for taking this seriously." "You handled yourself with strength and clarity, Miss Harper," he replied. "It's not easy standing up to family, but you did the right thing." After the call, I allowed myself a quiet moment. I walked out to the porch, sat in the old rocking chair my mother once loved, and stared out across the hills. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees in golden streaks, and for the first time in weeks, I could exhale without tension curling in my chest. The cabin was safe. Franklin was being held accountable, and I, after years of silence, avoidance, and carefully sidestepping conflict, had stood my ground. Later that weekend, Jill returned with a bottle of wine, and we sat on the porch long into the night, sipping slowly and listening to the wind rustle through the trees. "To the end of his games," she said, raising her glass. I clinked mine against hers. "And to not letting anyone decide our worth again." She smiled, and in that moment I realized this battle wasn't just about legal rights or financial boundaries. It was about reclaiming something much harder to define: dignity, voice, and the belief that it's never too late to protect what matters. We had stood up, not just for ourselves, but for the younger versions of us who didn't yet know how. And that, more than anything, was justice. The days that followed were quieter, but they weren't empty. In the absence of court filings and phone calls from lawyers, in the space left behind by Franklin's manipulations, something unexpected began to take root: peace. Not the kind that arrives suddenly, like a wave washing everything clean, but the quieter kind that seeps into the corners of a life once filled with tension and teaches you how to breathe again. I didn't hear much from Franklin after the formal charges were filed. There were no more calls, no more appearances at the cabin, and no more attempts to explain himself. Whether it was fear, shame, or the inevitability of consequences finally catching up to him, I didn't know. What mattered was that the silence he left behind wasn't laced with dread this time. It was relief. One afternoon, my mother's sister Miriam called. She had always tried to maintain some kind of connection after Mom passed, though Franklin's presence made that nearly impossible. Her voice was careful, tinged with caution as she asked, "You know how Franklin gets, Lena? Maybe there's another way to settle all this." But I was no longer the girl who second-guessed her right to draw a line. "I know exactly how he gets," I said evenly, "and that's why I did what I had to do." She didn't argue. For once, there was no defense on his behalf, no push to preserve peace at the cost of my well-being. Just a long sigh and a quiet, "I hope you find peace." "I already have," I told her, and I meant it. In the weeks that followed, Jill and I spent several weekends at the cabin, not to fix anything broken, but to honour what had endured. We painted the trim a deeper shade of green to match the forest beyond the windows, patched a leak in the roof that had gone unnoticed in all the recent chaos, and planted wildflowers along the edge of the fence line, ones my mother had once loved, but Franklin had claimed were too much work to maintain. Each brushstroke, each nail driven into cedar, each blossom tucked into the soil felt like stitching together a wound that had finally stopped bleeding. The cabin no longer felt like a place that needed defending. It felt like home again. One crisp Saturday evening, as Jill and I sat on the porch with 2 glasses of mulled wine and the sun dipped behind the distant ridge, she turned to me with a question that hung in the air like the final note of a long song. "So, what's next for you, Lena? You got the cabin back. You stood up to him. What now?" I thought for a moment, watching the steam rise from my glass, and let the answer form not from ambition or anger, but from something steadier: conviction. "I keep going," I said. "I'll keep volunteering, keep travelling, keep choosing my life on my terms. But this time, I won't let anyone else decide how I live it, or how much of myself I have to give up to keep the peace." She nodded, smiling in that quiet way only a best friend can, and raised her glass. "To choosing yourself," she said. "To never handing that choice over again," I replied, and we drank to that. That night, as I stood alone by the fireplace, the same one where I'd sat as a child, as a grieving daughter, and now as a woman who had finally drawn her own boundaries, I realized how much I had changed. Not in some dramatic, sweeping way, but in the way that matters most. I no longer feared being alone. I no longer mistook silence for safety, and I no longer saw confrontation as the opposite of love, but as the price of self-respect. Franklin had tried to take something irreplaceable, but in doing so, he forced me to reclaim far more than he ever understood. The cabin stood not just as a place of memory, but as a symbol of growth, of the strength it takes to speak when your voice has been ignored for years, and the grace required to protect without becoming bitter. And so, life settled into a new rhythm. The floors creaked the same way they always had. The wind still rustled through the pine trees each morning, but something inside me had shifted. I didn't just own this place, I belonged to it, and more importantly, to myself. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you once called family, if you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes of silence, then this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more powerful stories of resilience, quiet justice, and second chances. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming untouchable.